Hi everyone, welcome back to our technical podcast series. And just as a reminder, in our previous session, we talked about SAP transaction codes or applications, as well as Fiori applications, Web10 Pro applications, RFC function modules, all the different ways on how users can execute specific functionality. In today's session, we will be talking about authorization default values. And for that discussion, I'm joined by my colleague, Ross Robertson. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks, Emile. It's a pleasure being here as always.
Right. So as mentioned, we're talking about authorization default values. So to understand what that means, when a transaction is executed, so it's an authorization called by the authority check, and to determine what those certain authorizations will be included in the roles that we are building. So can you maybe please explain to us just a bit more about how authorization defaults work?
More than happy to do so, Emile. So I think authorization defaults at its core is effectively your authorization check table, which is a core part of the authorization concept within SAP. So every transaction code, every OData service, every RFC function module, etc., will have underlying authorization defaults and will tie back to the authorization check table. Very effectively, your underlying ABAP program behind this SAP application is going to look at the authorization check table in the system and effectively break down those underlying authorization object checks and values at certain steps of processing within the transaction code to basically check for certain authorization objects and field values during that step of processing within the program itself. So that is what will be known to our administrators as transaction SU24. But behind transaction SU24, you have your table USOBT_C. The breakdown of authorization check defaults is effectively the SAP standard defaults, which are provided via transaction SU22 or table USOBT. Moving up into customer or customizable defaults for each solution. Of course, every organization has different requirements and different solutions that require different maintenance over and above the SAP standard provided defaults. SAP provides then SU24 and table USOBT_C for custom or customer based defaults. That will be where the customer or the client will basically customize these check tables to suit their requirements. So by assigning an authorization object to a transaction code, let's take this, we'll stick with transaction code for this example, is effectively tying an authorization object and fields and potential authorization object and potential specific field values to be checked during our processing within the transaction code. And of course, how we assign access to these applications, whether it's Fiori or transaction codes, etc., everything that we've mentioned before, that needs to go through a SAP role. So that's, again, a big part of the authorization concept. So by assigning a role to a user, you're effectively granting them a bucket of authorizations. Within that role will house your SAP applications. And underneath those applications, they will bring along with them all of the required or all of the detailed or specified authorization defaults that are populated within this authorization check table, being SU24 or USOBT_C.
Ross, thank you for that. So if we now talk a bit more about specifics, let's think about a transaction like MIGO. It's for goods movement, but it can be used for goods receipt. It can be used for goods issue. It can also be used to just display goods movements. So how would you practically then do authorization default checks for a transaction like that?
That definitely poses a challenge or something to get around for a lot of organizations, in that you do get certain applications within SAP that perform multiple different functions that are not just going to sit with a single user or a single job function within your user base. MIGO is a perfect example of that. There are some others, for example, F110 for executing of payment runs, and any other number of transaction codes within the system, primarily for splitting between display and processing. But for the MIGO example, goods movements, they kind of sit across the entire business process flow. So you're going to have a lot of users in the system that are only going to need to perform goods receipts, but not necessarily perform goods issues. Or over and above that, for example, more sensitive movement types like scrapping of assets, as an example. You don't want your kind of warehouse clerks who are perhaps just doing goods receipts to be able to scrap asset values over and above by using something like MIGO. So SAP's provided quite a useful function within your authorization default maintenance ability to be able to define certain variants of authorization defaults for certain transaction codes or these SAP applications that we've discussed. So using MIGO as an example, I can create a goods receipt variant of the authorization defaults for MIGO. I can then specify the exact movement types that I want to be associated with that variant. So I can only choose to include that your general 101s, 102s, all your kind of movement types associated with goods receipts, but over and above that, exclude your goods receipt, your goods movements that are perhaps tied to goods issues or scrapping, etc. By then taking that variant, allocating that variant to the role that is eventually going to go to our users, that's going to ensure that they can access MIGO, they can process the goods receipt movements that they are supposed to, but they will not be able to execute using MIGO the goods movements that they shouldn't be performing as part of their daily function, and how that can then be split up into multiple variants of the same single transaction code to enable us to control on what users are supposed to perform in their job function.
Ross, thank you very much for that. So just a quick summary then of that. So the authorization default checks, it's not just for us to assist with role building, because it will ensure that the correct authorizations are included within our roles when we are building our roles, but it actually performs a level of control to ensure that the users only receives the authorizations they require for that specific transaction, and there is not over assignment at that lower level. And as you also alluded in the previous podcast, where we just talked about, because of the granularity of authorizations and how that also plays into potential license costs, that it's very important to ensure only the correct and associated authorizations exist within your authorization default checks. So thanks for everyone for listening to our podcast today. We hope to see you in the next one. And in the next one, we'll talk about how your transactions, your Fiori applications can be used to, along with your authorization default checks, can be used to build roles. So until the next one, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.